quiet hours of the night, when the world has grown still, we turn to stories that drift like whispers across time. History, after all, is not only about battles and rulers, it is also about the wounds that linger, the memories carried silently through generations, and the lessons that continue to echo into the present. Tonight, we journey into one such story: the Dutch East Indies, exploitation in Indonesia. A tale not only of spices and trade, but of lives reshaped, of cultures pressed into silence, and of resilience that endured even under the weight of empire. Here, in this space we call Void Histories, we invite you to listen slowly, without hurry. Let the rhythm of these words settle gently, like waves against the shore. Stay a while and allow the past to speak softly to you as we wander together into the quiet shadows of memory. The Dutch East Indies, exploitation in Indonesia. There was once a land far away where the ocean kissed the horizon with endless tenderness. A chain of islands stretched like scattered jewels upon the water, each one carrying its own song, its own story. Before the world called it the Dutch East Indies, before the maps were redrawn by foreign hands, it was a place of balance, of rhythm, of quiet harmony. The people who lived here did not measure their days by clocks or ledgers. Their time was guided by the rains and the sun, by the growing of rice and the flowering of spices. When morning broke, golden light spilled gently across the rice paddies, shimmering like a sea of mirrors, and farmers walked slowly into the fields, their bare feet sinking into the cool, wet earth. They moved in patterns taught to them not by rulers, but by the wisdom of generations, by the memory of ancestors whose song still lived in the wind. The land was generous. It offered nutmeg and cloves, cinnamon and pepper, fragrances so rich they perfumed the air, carried by traders who came from distant shores. In bustling markets, voices rose like music, blending into the calls of sellers, the laughter of children, the bargaining of neighbors who knew each other by name. These were places not only of commerce, but of community, where exchange was measured as much in friendship as in goods. Temples stood quietly among trees, their stones softened by moss and age, filled with prayers that rose like smoke to the heavens. Rituals bound people to the earth, to the spirits, and to one another. Every ceremony was a thread woven into the larger fabric of life, a fabric that seemed too strong, too intricate, ever to be torn apart. Evenings were soft and unhurried. Families gathered around small fires, listening to the voices of elders who told stories of origins, of gods, of heroes, and of lessons meant to be carried into the heart. In these islands, culture was not only something practiced, it was lived. Dances moved like waves, shadow puppets flickered against lantern light, and music drifted from bamboo flutes, weaving its way through the night air. These were not luxuries, but necessities, for they reminded the people who they were and where they belonged. And so life went on, simple but not lacking, gentle yet full. It was a life in which the earth gave freely, and the people gave back with gratitude. A life where hardship existed, yes, storms, illness, famine sometimes, but it was met with resilience, for the people faced it together. What mattered most was not possession, but belonging. Belonging to the land, to each other, to the unseen threads that held the world in balance. Yet, even as this peace endured, changes were stirring beyond the horizon. Great ships, heavy with sails, rode the currents of distant seas. They were pushed not only by wind, but by desire. Desire for the very spices that grew in these islands, the treasures of the earth that perfumed the air. From faraway lands, men had set their sights on this archipelago, not as a home, but as a possession. And though their arrival began with smiles and gestures of trade, Hidden within their journeys were ambitions vast and unrelenting. What the people of these islands could not yet see was that their harmony, their balance, their way of life was already being marked upon maps and measured in profits. The distant rumble of sails was a signal, faint but undeniable, of a tide that would come to change everything. And so, beneath skies of peace, in villages of laughter, in fields of rice that swayed gently in the wind, history was quietly shifting. The horizon that once promised only new trade and friendly faces would soon deliver something heavier. The seeds of change had already been planted, and with them the first shadows of a story that was yet to unfold. And in that stillness, before the storms of empire, the land took one final breath of peace. Before the winds of conquest carried new voices to its shores, the sails arrived quietly, at first, like distant birds gliding upon the horizon. They brought men who stepped ashore with cautious smiles, their hands carrying gifts, their voices speaking of friendship and trade. To the people of the islands, they were not the first foreigners to arrive. Traders had come before, Chinese, Indian, Arab, bringing silks, metals, and ideas. And so these new visitors, with pale faces and unfamiliar tongues, were welcomed as others had been welcomed. At the beginning, the exchange seemed simple: spices for silver, cloves for cloth, nutmeg for coins that shone bright in the sun. Villages and ports opened themselves to this new current of trade, curious, perhaps even hopeful. But beneath the friendly greetings lay a different intention, one that grew clearer with every ship that docked and every fort that was built along the coasts. The Dutch did not come only as merchants, they came with soldiers, with cannons, and with plans that stretched beyond the market stalls. The gifts they brought were soon overshadowed by demands. They did not wish simply to trade, they wished to control. Where once a farmer could sell his harvest freely, now contracts were forced upon him. Contracts written in a language he did not understand, binding his labor to men he had never known. It began slowly, almost quietly, like vines creeping along the walls of a home. A port closed to outsiders, except those permitted by Dutch authority. A ruler pressed into signing an agreement that limited his people's freedom. Forts rose on the shores, strongholds of stone and gunpowder, symbols not of partnership, but of dominance. The people noticed the change in rhythm. Markets that once sang with many voices now echoed with the control of one. Spices, once traded for life's necessities, became locked away, stored in warehouses guarded by soldiers. Ships sailed not with the spirit of exchange, but with the burden of monopoly. The wealth of the islands was no longer flowing outward with balance. It was being drained, pulled across oceans to a land far away. For the villagers, the change was felt most sharply in daily life. Fields once tended with freedom became places of obligation. Farmers who had chosen their crops now bent to the will of foreign overseers. The harvest was no longer theirs to share with family, nor theirs to bring to market. It was demanded, measured, and shipped away. A life once guided by the rhythm of nature was now bound to the ticking of foreign demands. Whispers began to spread in the villages. Some spoke of the betrayal of trust, of guests who had become masters. Others spoke of the growing fear, soldiers who patrolled with weapons and strangers who recorded what was grown, what was harvested, what was owed. Yet, within these whispers, there was also the stirring of something else: resentment, quiet but deep, like embers waiting for the wind. The Dutch had come not as neighbors but as rulers, though they did not announce it openly. They cloaked their intentions in treaties, in contracts, in the language of trade, but the truth grew undeniable. The freedom of the islands was slipping away, replaced by an order not chosen by its people. The conflict was not yet war, not yet open rebellion. It was quieter than that. It was the tightening of rules, the rising of resentment, the feeling of a chain that grew heavier each year. Yet, in that silence, a strength was forming. For the people of the islands were not without memory. They remembered the balance of their ancestors, the freedom of their fields, the laughter of their children, and they knew, deep within, that no contract and no fort could truly erase what had been theirs for centuries. And so, while the Dutch tightened their hold, the people began to carry in their hearts the seeds of resistance, seeds that would not remain hidden forever, but would soon grow into the first fires of defiance. The silence of discontent could not last forever. In the villages, in the forests, and along the shores, the people began to resist. At first, it was quiet disobedience, harvests hidden away, agreements ignored, spice plants cut down so that no overseer could claim them. These acts were small, but they carried with them the weight of defiance, a reminder that dignity could not be erased so easily. But the Dutch noticed, and as power grew heavier, so too did the punishments. Villages that defied were burned. Leaders who resisted were taken, their voices silenced so that others might learn to fear. Yet instead of extinguishing the fire of resistance, these acts only fanned its flames. For every elder lost, another rose. For every field destroyed, another hand planted anew. The people of the islands carried within them a resilience older than empire, rooted deep in the soil they called their own. Soon, resistance became open war. Kingdoms that had once traded with the Dutch now turned against them. Armies of villagers stood shoulder to shoulder with their rulers, carrying spears, bows, and the courage of desperation. They faced soldiers armed with muskets and cannons, their weapons far weaker, their armor nothing but the will to defend their homes. Still, they fought, for to surrender meant more than losing land. It meant losing the hearts of who they were. The wars spread across the islands, in Banda, in Mataram, in countless villages too small to be written in foreign records. Battles erupted. Smoke rose into the skies, mingling with the cries of the fallen. The Dutch responded with overwhelming force, their ships circling the coasts, their guns thundering against the earth. Yet even under such fire, resistance endured, for the people fought not merely for victory, but for memory, for the memory of freedom, and for the generations yet to come. These wars, though brave, often ended in tragedy. Villages left in ruins, families torn apart, fields once green now trampled into mud. Yet within each defeat lay a kind of victory, the refusal to accept silence. Every rebellion, though crushed, left behind a story. Stories whispered by mothers to children at night, of fathers who stood tall against cannons, of leaders who chose death over surrender. Stories that carried the reminder that even in defeat, there was dignity. For the Dutch, these rebellions were seen as interruptions to empire, disturbances to order. For the people, they were proof that the spirit of the land could not be fully bound. No matter how many treaties were signed, no matter how many soldiers patrolled the villages, the resistance returned, again and again, like the tide that never stops meeting the shore. And so, the wars continued, sometimes great, sometimes small, sometimes hidden in shadows. They were not just clashes of weapons, but of worlds, one that sought to dominate, and one that sought only to live in harmony as it had before. The Dutch, with their cannons, could destroy bodies, but they could not destroy memory. They could burn fields, but they could not erase the rhythm of seasons. They could silence voices, but not the whispers that moved through generations. The first wars left scars deep upon the land and deeper still upon the people. But even in the ashes, hope remained. For hope, like seeds, survives even when buried. It waits in the silence, It waits in the darkness until the day comes when it can rise again. And though the people faced defeat, though the empire pressed harder, the spirit of resistance did not vanish. It merely shifted, waiting, gathering, preparing for the next struggle that would shape the story of the islands once more. The first flames of resistance had been lit, but they did not burn without consequence. The empire struck back with the weight of its cannons, with soldiers trained in the ways of modern war, and with ships that controlled the seas. For every rebellion that rose, there was a swift and merciless reply. Villages were razed, leaders captured or killed, and the people left with grief heavy upon their shoulders. And yet, even in defeat, the spirit of defiance lingered, refusing to disappear. But as wars dragged on, exhaustion settled deep into the bones of the land. The people had fought bravely, but the cost was high. Harvests were destroyed, families displaced, children left without fathers to guide them. The Dutch, knowing that endless wars could not secure an empire, turned to something more subtle, but no less binding. Agreements written not with fairness, but with force. These agreements were called treaties, though in truth they were chains. Local rulers, weary from conflict, were pressed to sign papers that demanded loyalty to the Dutch East India Company. Some were offered gifts, others threatened with violence, but in the end, the ink flowed. With each signature, freedom slipped quietly away. Villages were told what crops to grow and when to grow them. Fields that once provided rice for families were now filled with coffee, sugar, or indigo, crops that could not be eaten, but that fed the wealth of Europe. The people worked, but the harvest was no longer theirs. Ship after ship carried their labor across the seas, leaving hunger behind. What had once been abundance became scarcity. What had once been choice became obligation. And for the villagers, the treaties signed by rulers far above them became invisible burdens, binding their lives in ways they could not escape. The agreements also demanded obedience and governance. Local rulers were not free to decide for their people, but acted as intermediaries of empire. In this way, the Dutch extended their reach without needing to be everywhere at once. Power was maintained not only through soldiers, but through systems that ensured compliance. The wars had shifted from the battlefield to the parchment, but the result was the same, the steady erosion of freedom. And yet, resistance still flickered. Some villages refused to plant as they were told, burning their fields rather than surrendering their harvests. Others rose in new rebellions, desperate attempts to break the chains that treaties had fastened around their lives. But these too were met with punishment, swift and unforgiving. Each uprising was crushed, leaving behind not only scars on the land, but despair in the hearts of those who dreamed of freedom. The treaties, in their quiet cruelty, were often more devastating than open war. A war could be fought with courage, and even in loss, there was honor. But a treaty, signed, sealed, enforced, was a silence that pressed upon generations. It dictated lives without the sound of gunfire, without the smoke of battle, yet it bound just as tightly as iron chains. Still, in the silence, memory endured. The people remembered what life had been before the agreements, before the forts, before the endless demands of empire. And in that memory, there was sorrow, but also strength. For memory could not be taken by contract. Memory could not be erased by ink. And so, as the wars gave way to treaties, and as the treaties reshaped the rhythm of life, the people carried within them the quiet ache of loss and the unspoken hope that one day the chains would be broken. The story of empire was far from over, and the struggle, though subdued, still lingered like embers waiting for breath. The chains of empire were not only forged in forts and treaties, they lived in the quiet moments of daily life, in the weariness of fathers, in the silence of mothers, in the hollow eyes of children who grew up under a sky that no longer felt their own. Wars may have scarred the land, but it was in the villages, in the homes, that the deepest wounds were carved. Families who once knew abundance now faced hunger. Fields of rice that had nourished generations were replaced with crops that could not feed them. Coffee, sugar, and indigo grew tall, but they offered no nourishment to the stomachs of children. Mothers, once proud of their harvest baskets, now returned from the fields with hands empty, their hearts heavy with the sound of children's cries. Fathers bent their backs beneath the weight of labor that gave them no rest, no reward, only fatigue that deepened with every passing season. For the children, the wounds were quieter, but no less deep. They were raised not in freedom, but in a world where obedience was demanded before they could learn the meaning of choice. Their childhoods were shortened by labor, their laughter muted by hunger, their dreams reshaped by the boundaries of a system designed to keep them small. These were the lost generations, children who grew into adulthood carrying not the stories of joy, but the heavy silence of submission. Culture, too, bore the scars. Traditions that had been passed down for centuries were pushed aside, diminished by foreign power. Languages once spoken with pride were belittled, and rituals that bound communities together were dismissed as superstition. The colonizers did not merely take crops, they tried to take identity. They sought to reshape memory itself so that a people might forget who they were. And yet, memory resisted. In secret songs, in whispered prayers, in dances performed in the quiet of night, the people preserved fragments of their soul, hidden like embers, waiting for the chance to glow again. The wounds of empire were not only physical, they were emotional, spiritual, generational. They were the feeling of belonging to land that no longer belonged to you, the feeling of working endlessly, knowing the fruit of your labor would vanish across oceans, the feeling of raising children into a future that offered them no promise but the same burden. These wounds were invisible, yet they lived in every gesture, every silence, every sigh that escaped the lips of a weary people. And so, an ache settled over the islands, an ache that grew with each passing year. It was an ache of loss, but also of longing, longing for what had been, longing for what could be. Entire generations grew up in its shadow, their lives shaped not by the abundance of their land, but by the absence of freedom. They became bridges between a past they remembered through stories and a future they could not yet reach. Still, even in sorrow, there was resilience. In the lullabies sung to children at night, in the stories whispered around fires, in the quiet rituals carried on in secret, the people held on to threads of hope. They carried their wounds, yes, but within those wounds, they carried the seed of endurance. For pain, though heavy, can also sharpen memory, and memory, though fragile, can become the foundation of survival. And so, the lost generations lived on, bearing wounds they did not choose, yet keeping alive the spirit of what had been. Their suffering became a bridge between darkness and light, between silence and voice, and though their days passed in shadow, the story of their endurance would one day rise again, carried forward into the long struggle for freedom. When we look back now, across the centuries, it is not only the battles and treaties that remain in memory, but the quiet weight of what was endured. The Dutch East Indies was more than a colony. It was a place where millions of lives unfolded under the long shadow of empire. To remember it is to remember not only the violence of conquest, but the silences of suffering, the wounds carried quietly by generations who had no choice but to endure. The scars are not carved only in the land, though the land still remembers. Plantations stretch where forests once stood, and the echoes of foreign rule linger in the very patterns of fields, roads, and cities. The scars live also in memory, passed down through families, through songs, through fragments of language, through the ache of longings that even today is not entirely gone. For history does not vanish when rulers depart, it stays, etched into the rhythms of life, whispering its lessons to those who are willing to listen. And yet, alongside the wounds, there is endurance. There is the quiet miracle of survival. For though empires sought to break the spirit of a people, that spirit did not vanish. It lived in resistance, in secret traditions, in the stubbornness of memory. It lived in the quiet dignity of those who labored without reward, and in the songs sung by mothers to children who would carry hope into the future. It lived in the way culture adapted, sometimes reshaped, but never erased. Even in the deepest night, the ember of identity glowed faintly, waiting for dawn. As we reflect upon this history, we must move slowly, with gentleness, as one might trace the scars of an old wound. To understand colonialism is not to count only the profits of empire, but to count the cost in lives, in hunger, in lost generations. It is to see that behind every shipment of spices was a family who went without food. Behind every fort and treaty was a village that lost its freedom. Behind every measure of wealth was the exhaustion of a people whose voices were silenced. And yet, there is also a truth that rises gently, like light upon the horizon. No empire, however strong, is eternal. The Dutch East Indies, like all empires, came and went, but the people of the islands remained. They endured, and in time, they reclaimed what was theirs. The land, though scarred, still belongs to them. The songs, though interrupted, are still sung. The culture, though suppressed, still dances in the streets and lives in the breath of language. The past cannot be undone, but it can be remembered, and through remembrance, honored. So tonight, as we let this story settle softly in our minds, we hold both the sorrow and the strength. We acknowledge the wounds, but also the survival. We see the pain, but we also see the persistence of life. And in that balance, there is a lesson, not only about Indonesia, not only about empire, but about humanity itself. That even in the longest shadows, light finds a way to remain. That even in silence, memory speaks. And that the dignity of a people cannot be erased, not by treaties, not by cannons, not by centuries of foreign rule. The story of the Dutch East Indies is a story of loss, but is also a story of endurance. It is a reminder that history is not only written in the victories of empires, but in the quiet survival of those who endured them. And as we close this reflection, as night deepens and silence surrounds us, we are left with a gentle thought that the past still whispers softly, guiding us to listen, to remember, and to carry its lessons into tomorrow. And so the story rests, like the tide upon the shore, leaving behind traces of sorrow and traces of strength for us to hold as we drift into the quiet embrace of sleep.